Cool, right. So I want to talk about agency in language. And so I want to start everyone off by think about a conversation that you've had that you remember from time to time, maybe with someone you care about, someone who cares about you, maybe one with a stranger. Do you have one in mind? Okay. So what made that conversation meaningful to you? What are the words that sort of replay in your head when you think about it? What are the concepts that stick with you? So the language that we use and create shape us and the world around us. When we encounter a concept that we think was placed there by someone else in their use of language, we feel compelled to do certain things. I think of the things we're compelled to do by a concept as that concept's meaning. And there are several different kinds of meaning. So, intentional meaning is the meaning of a concept with respect to what criteria sort of comprise it. So if I have the concept of a lecture, we might have a couple of criteria for what counts as a lecture and what doesn't. So a lecture is a kind of language use. It's a monologue from a speaker to an audience, and it's typically about transferring some true knowledge to the audience. And this contrasts it with like storytelling. And of course, you can see that the meaning of a lecture, its intention is built on other concepts, right? It's built on concepts like language or monologue. But for the sake of understanding lecture, we can just take these other concepts' meanings for granted. This is often contrasted with something called extensional meaning, which is whatever this refers to in context. So in this context, the lecture is this time that we're sharing together, the activity of me saying things and you listening. And this kind of meaning, when it's invoked, asks us to shift our attention to a particular kind of thing. There's a third kind of meaning that is somewhat harder to pin down, and that is connotation. And that's sort of everything that sort of sits outside of this concept. This is what this concept does to the context in which we place it. So, for example, we wouldn't put it in the intentional meaning of a lecture that the lecturer is someone who has authority. But if I say Alane is giving a lecture at a conference, we might infer from it that Alane is the kind of person who would have authority to give a lecture. So when we encounter language that other people use, we're compelled to sort of use these different kind of meanings to interpret that word. And when we decide to say something, we have to search through all the concepts we have available to us to try to get as close as we can to what exactly we want to say. This is a hard problem. We can never fully say exactly what we mean, even though we try. And because it's so hard, there's a lot of things we can do to make it easier. We can create new concepts. We can also have concepts that are definitionally vague. So vague concepts allow us to sort of broadly gesture at what we mean. But they don't require us to really fill in the meaning perfectly. So one example of this would be the word thing, which definitionally has like no intentional meaning because we can sort of use it to refer to anything, right? I could talk about that thing or whatever. If it has a general connotation when I use it, what it sort of evokes might be that me as the speaker has not chosen some more specific word to use. So I'm either intentionally being vague or I can't be any more precise. So that's thing. But thing is not the only thing like it. Lots of other words have this as their sort of intentional meaning where it's undefined. For example, we like to debate the intention of different concepts, like we might ask, is a hot dog a sandwich? We take the hot dog for granted, and in this question, we're sort of asking ourselves, what goes in here for a hot dog? Another example, these concepts end up somewhat self-referential. So if we talk about like nobility, to be noble is to be recognized as noble or to have some particular relationship with someone who is. And it doesn't really matter why, like what is the constituent stuff inside of being noble. What really matters about that concept is everything it implies, which is maybe a certain kind of respect. Okay, so I think that a lot of concepts that we like to evoke today in these spaces like these are vague, and vague concepts are very useful. We say things like learning or consciousness or thinking or reasoning, and I've never seen any sort of satisfying intentional definition of any of these, but we use these terms, and it is useful to have terms like this. So what I want to focus on is the term AI, artificial intelligence. Okay, there's a lot of things that the invocation of this concept asks us to do. So when I repeat things that I've heard other people say, like AI consciousness is inevitable, or we have not yet absorbed what AI is about to do to us, what comes to your mind or like to your heart, right? That feeling is part of the connotation, what that concept evokes to us. So one of the really special things that this concept in particular does when it's invoked is it asks us to believe that there is some criteria that we don't know about, but there is a possible intentional meaning that if we were all presented with it, we would agree on it, right? And then we could say what is AI and what is not AI. I don't believe we actually can have this criteria, and I'm not the only one who believes this. And when we have a concept that promises something to us that it actually fundamentally cannot deliver, and we're not aware of that as a fact, we're going to be led down paths that this concept asks us to be led down, which in this case might be something like relinquishing our agency to something we can only believe in and don't allow ourselves to fully understand. Okay, so this is where it might be useful to go to the second type of meaning, which is reference. And we can talk about the reference of AI today, which is LLMs, right? This is not the only reference that AI has had. We've had other kinds of AI in the past, obviously. So what is a large language model? I'm actually really happy that like several of the talks already have like almost said the same thing I'm about to now. So hopefully it'll be more reinforcing, which is all LLMs are trained on text data, which was written by people on the internet. And when someone chooses to write something, they construct what they say, given the concepts and other sort of processes, structured processes available to them. And there's a lot of different structured processes like this. So you might be familiar with something like syntax. So here, different concepts and different words fall into different categories. So we might have nouns, we might have verbs, and we also have some structure in what kind of combinations of these categories are more likely to appear in the data than others. Analogy is another example. So because of how we structure information in our world, we will, even with the most rudimentary language models that have the same number of parameters as there are words, we can encode relationships like between a country and its capital in consistent ways. So, right, US and DC and France and Paris, even with the most rudimentary models, we're encoding this. And even something like common sense, is something that we can lean on when we decide what to say. So even if I don't say it's explicitly due to gravity, I'm more likely to say something will fall than that it will like fly off into the air. So every piece of text on the internet was generated by exploiting and building on these structured processes. And those concepts and processes give us, that is the language model that we're operating on. To repeat what we heard earlier, today's neural models are compressed representations of the data that we train them on. Any particular neural network has a capacity, which is the maximum amount of information it can store, and this is defined by the number of parameters in the model. And we can also count the amount of information we're trying to stuff into it through training. And it turns out there's way more information on the internet than there is parameters in the model. So we have to stuff a bunch of stuff into a small space. What would be the most economical way to stuff that in? It would be to represent the structures that generated that data. So it's not surprising to me that we learn things like analogy or syntax or even common sense when the models that we're training are just compressed versions of this. Those kinds of models, the base language models, are apparently useless for most of the things that we want to do with LLMs. We want something that does what we want. We do this through instruction tuning, where we're going to adjust the model ever so slightly so that when we send in something to say, it appears that something's coming back to us that appears like a response, that we interpret as a response. And we can do this very easily because another structure that underlies the language use on the internet is that people talk to each other. We have people asking a question and then another person responding. So these kind of structure, which is also called an adjacency pair in the study of conversation, appears in the training data already. And then the last step of this recipe is, of course, reinforcement learning from human feedback, where we're sort of shifting the distribution of the model a little bit. We're having different paths in the activation space more likely than others. Maybe we want to put everything through one region, which represents the region of like the helpful assistant. And when we talk about something like agents, These artifacts appear to be using external feedback to iteratively adapt and manipulate the systems in which they're placed. But really crucially is we're choosing to place those artifacts in those systems that we have designed, in the environments we have designed. And we're sort of institutionalizing the interpretation of whatever comes out of our model in those systems. Okay, so what's an LLM? It's a computational artifact into which we've dissolved the structure underlying language use. And that is what a language model is intentionally. That is sort of what makes it up, right? I think it's uncontroversial to say that what a language model is. But what I'm sweeping under the rug here is that there actually is a lot of other connotation for AI and LLMs. Because these models are compressed versions of text, then it really is hard to distinguish the things that come out of the model from things that a person would say. It appears to exploit our drive to read intentionality into language use, especially when it becomes personal. And if I had slides, I would pull up the Wikipedia article for deaths linked to chatbots. People do take these things more seriously beyond their intentional meaning. So I say that modern generative AI technologies are the reference of AI, but I think I'm being imprecise, because if they were, then why are we continuing to put so much time and energy and emotion into aspiring towards something that we apparently still don't have? I'll go back to this sort of connotational meaning of AI, which is that it sort of asks us to continually seek this intentional meaning, whatever the criteria is, but so that we can agree on when we've sort of achieved AI. And I think another concept that presents itself this way is intelligence. And I think to those who let themselves be driven by this concept of intelligence, this project of reaching AI is both to discover this unquestionable criteria and also manifest it in some artifact. And so if you're empirically driven you believe in this concept, you might develop criteria like benchmarks that allow you to say, I don't know yet whether we have AI, but here's something that if it was passed, like, I will give it the check. We also might be a denialist where we're like, there's some fundamental property of AI that can't be true. There's this piece, I think, from Gary Marcus, which is like, probabilistic models can never be AI. That's another example. But the pattern that both this empirical person and the denialist face is that they both still believe in this concept and let themselves be driven by it. This concept asks more of us than its connotations. It asks us what we ought to do, or even tells us what will happen to us once we've agreed on this criteria and once we've had people in positions of authority agree with having reached it. So, think back to how you feel when you hear someone say AI is imminent, right? So we've imagined for a while what life might be like if we were forced to live with intelligent machines. And so the kind of fictional characters like the Terminator or HAL 9000, which are really brought to life by this concept and what it connotes, are really just the products and property of the stories about how we might lose our agency to systems that we don't allow ourselves to fully understand. So AI is a concept that justifies itself, but to be clear, concepts don't have agency, we do. We justify the concept and allow it to justify itself through stories, prophecies, benchmarks, predictions, etc. So AI is the kind of concept that really does exist if we believe it does and we allow ourselves to be governed by it. But like many other concepts like this, we have the agency to determine its fate. So what shall we do if we wake up one day and it seems that everyone's decided we have AI? What is there to do next? If we've allowed ourselves to respond to this inevitability by saying, okay, computing is finished, humanity is finished, like, what comes afterwards? I think we have the agency to say, like, so what? We can choose how to respond to such a claim. We have agency to make decisions about technology. I think we can demand more from the technology we build, and I think we have more agency than others. We are in the rooms where these decisions are being made, and we can design our technologies around human values, for example, like empowering other people. And then the last thing is, remember, we have agency over language. We have the agency to reject framing of inevitability and powerlessness over technology, rather than depending on proselytizing people into believing something that we are actually making real through prophecy. And so remember, we have agency over language, and with that, we have agency over meaning, and with that, we have agency over ourselves and the world around us. Thank you.